be back here to introduce a former student, Sanjay. Let me see, I will have to read it. Sanjay did his bachelor degree in physics in St. Stephen's College in Delhi in India. And he came here and did his master's degree here. And then after that, he was on a Krauss Fellowship and went to Capitol Hill as aide to Congressman Frank Pallone of New Jersey, who is now a senior member of House Committee. I believe he's that. Let me see what I write here. Energy Commerce. Okay. When he was in the Capitol Hill, he happened to meet Alejandro Pachuri, right? Who is actually Director General of IPCC, and he was invited back to India and joined TERI, which is a top global think tank on science, technology, and environment. And so Sanjay went back and stayed in TERI, and where Pachuri is the director. Okay? And Sanjay went back to India, stayed there for a few years, and he joined World Bank, and where, as you probably all read that one, he's basically working on the South Asia Environmental and Water Resource Unit of the World Bank that basically take care of all 7 countries, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, all these places. It's really one of the major population, and of course the place that's most directly affected by the climate change. So Sanjay is really on the forefront of doing things that many of us here are interested in this from the academic point of view. And I mentioned that Sanjay actually is supposed to be my student, but you can tell, in case you don't know me, I'm a physical oceanographer, and my main interest is in ocean dynamics. And so you must wonder what that has anything to do with policy and conservation. In fact, it was the same question that I found myself got trapped there when Sanjay told me he's not really interested, that much interest in the kind of things I'm doing. But he was such an outstanding student, and as typical to many students I had in the past, if they're really good, what I do is, the first thing I do is send them to work with biologists. And so I asked him to talk to Professor Darcy Lonsdale. Unfortunately, she was not here. And Darcy at that time had a very large data set she collected in Saco River estuarine in Maine. And so I told Sanjay, why do you try to find something that has to do with modeling the life cycle of a copepods in estuaries? And as you can tell, this is really quite challenging things, because things that I do have to follow the Newton's law of motion, and the things that Darcy does, at least at that time, the things that mate. And so now none of us really know what Sanjay was doing, and so it was really, a shock. In less than half a year, Sanjay finished everything. He constructed the whole model from scratch, and he took Darcy's this voluminous data and tried to figure out what's in that data and figure out what kind of parameters should be to put in the model, and actually verify the model against the data, and then did the scientific study. I would say that even in today, this will be considered a real challenge for PhD thesis. And so it's not too surprising that Sanjay won at that time. I think now it's defunct. Pritchard Award in our Center for the Best Thesis Award. And then he was recommended to apply for the Krauss Fellowship, which of course is highly competitive. And there was also a part of interesting story, because Sanjay was really treated very badly when he applied that. I guess first probably because he's not American, and he told me also that he's Indian. So there's a combination of the two, and they really want to reject him from the start. And it was very fortunate at that time, Professor Anne McDowell, she then just came here as a director of Sea Grant. And so Anne fought very hard to get Sanjay to put in the list, and actually went to interview. And I know that Anne has been doing that for all the students in the last many years now as the director of graduate student program here. And so Sanjay went through the interview one step by step, and he told me last night that because the NOAA guy who was in charge of that really doesn't like him. And so he really gave him all the hard time, and Sanjay went all the way to the very top end and ended up the interview in the Frank Perron's office. And I think we're really proud, and I've been here for quite a few years, and certainly there's no doubt in my mind, Sanjay is certainly one of among the very best students we ever had here, and so really happy to have him back here and talk about something that, of course, is very, very important globally, and also I'm pretty sure many of here he will be interested as well. Okay.
Thank you. It's really embarrassing, I can tell you that, to introduce in this manner. And the bar has been set very high, so I'm sure you'll all be disappointed now with the presentation. So forgive me in advance. Essentially, the way I've structured my presentation is really to pose, I think, more problems. Because that's the reality that we face working in that region is we have 10,000 problems and probably less than half a solution, honestly, for it. And we still just keep bumbling along, trying to solve one problem, then we create two others in the process, really. So, and then to just share with you, first, in terms of the climate change vulnerability that South Asia really faces, then how does it relate to water? Because that's kind of the focus of my own work. I work primarily on water resources, not climate change. For me, climate change is one of the key areas related to water resources, especially in the context of human development that we work on. And then what are the kind of things we are trying to do? But also, please feel free to interrupt me at any time to ask a question, make a comment, anything. This is not supposed to be like, first I talk and then only you need. Please feel free to interrupt me anytime just to that. I would welcome it, no issues there at all. This is essentially a map of the region kind of that we work in. I primarily work on three rivers, which is Indus, Ganges, and then there's Yalul, Tsangpo in China, which we call Brahmaputra in India, and then Bangladesh. But you will see, you have so many rivers all flowing out of this Tibetan plateau, the Greater Himalayas. They go all the way from Iran here to China and here to Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar included. Just the water of the Greater Himalayas probably are supporting 1.5 billion people. And that doesn't include this part of India, the southern part, which is self-huge. I'm just looking at the rivers of North India, mind you. So 1.5 billion people, highly, and if I look at just the Ganges Basin, for example, this itself is 650 million people. To be precise, 654. So that's the kind of population that resides, in this region, and 1.5 billion practically is what, nearly 25% of the global population that you have dependent just on this third pole, as we like to call it, because this is such huge mass of water in terms of ice, glaciers. From a climate change perspective, again, you saw there was these large river basins, very diverse agroclimatic zone. For example, if you look at the high mountains of the Himalayas going, east, like Mount Everest is what, 8,848 meters. Through Sundarbans Delta, the distance is hardly a few hundred kilometers. And yet you're going within that all the way, you'll probably come across 5 climatic zones and go, from sea level up to the highest peak. It's really, the diversity is intimidating at times, really. Heavy reliance on monsoon and snow-fed rivers. 80% of our annual precipitation in South Asia. When I say South Asia, I really mean, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Bhutan, Nepal, those countries, happens, and then parts of China, happens in three months just, June, July, August, September, so roughly about 3 months. 80% of the precipitation really happens in 3 months. And then the rest of the 9 months really are dry months, so to say, effectively. And the water demand, especially here, if you look at it, it's really accelerating. It's not just increasing. And yet the sources are depleting both in terms of quality and then, both in terms of quantity and then quality, really. Very high pollution levels. Another interesting fact about South Asia, it's also the least integrated region in the world. Just if you look at trade, only 5% of the trade actually is within the region. 95% is outside, and you would expect to be much more. But politically, the countries themselves cannot come to really any consensus on that. There is the SARC, South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation, practically defunct. Really no exchange of commerce, of complexity, of expertise, of anything like that. It's easier for me to fly out of the region than come back to another place, rather than flying directly to them. Many times that's a problem. If I have to organize regional meetings, I go to Bangkok because half the participants can get a visa to any country, depending on the political dynamics. So actually I have to go outside the region even to organize my meetings, which are regional. So that's the kind of political environment we operate in, and water obviously is highly contentious. It's also the most vulnerable region probably with respect to climate change. This is South Asia. You'll notice very high population density. If you look at it, this one, like it's 300 plus. Very high poverty. This is like 40% are close to living on less than $1 a day. You don't see that anywhere else, such high levels of poverty. Africa has high levels of poverty, but the population density is low at least. East Asia and Pacific comes somewhere half. So that really makes the region really very, very vulnerable. The kind of solutions that you have to come up with are so unique, so distinct, that it's difficult to say, okay, let's go somewhere outside and see what people have been doing, and maybe we can learn from there and then develop solutions. Very, very difficult. Huge poverty levels, and poverty in every respect. Literacy levels, socially disadvantaged, huge kind of differences in terms of class or caste, those kind of things. Politically poor, don't really have a voice. So all those kind of things. And this is probably the first time ever actually, if you look at the last 5 years, that we've had elected governments in all countries of South Asia. Prior to that, we've never had a time when all countries had elected form of government. It's only been the last 5 years. But that's made my job even tougher, because now there's increased discourse on water by the civil society, by the communities, because of the elected governments. People are feeling much more confident, which is a very good thing. But decision making obviously has become a much kind of more difficult process, really, to be undertaken in that sense. If you look at if you remember the fourth assessment report by IPCC, look at the data sets here. The Himalayas. You will see very, very little up here. There's practically nothing. In fact, this was declared a white spot. So you have the so-called third pole, no data on it. Most glaciers are above 4,000 meters, and these are again in contested boundaries. There are boundaries between India and China, between India and Pakistan, between Nepal and Bhutan. You name it, and you will find a dispute really out there. And also very difficult region to, area to kind of work in. Imagine going above 4,000 meters and trying to set up some kind of stations. And when the political space itself is highly contested. So they declared it a white spot. So one of the third pole itself, so we keep talking of the North Pole and the South Pole, but after that, the so-called third pole, really there's no data being collected. Nobody's really doing any work. So there are different variations whether glaciers are melting, at what rate they are melting. This will again give you, this is by Maplecroft, which is an agency in UK which does. You'll notice how many countries here, how many cities are really climate vulnerable. There's only one outside, which is Lagos, Nigeria. The rest are all serviced by the Himalayan waters. 9 out of 10 top are in the region that we work in. Just to give you some sense of how climate vulnerable that is. If you look at it in terms of climate change risk, water, food, migration disaster, all four are here. I mean, and this again is agriculture and water stress. I mean, this is South Asia. Water use is really, as I said, increasing exponentially, and the population itself, this one, this blue line, both are rising the highest actually. If you look at this, the curve, it's steepest really for South Asia. This is vulnerability for floods. Countries are here. Average deaths and the population exposed to floods. You have Bangladesh, India, China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal, really all in this highest quadrant, so to say. Now, why did I talk about climate change when I work in water? This is why. It is so intrinsically linked, actually, when you talk of water or you talk climate change, the other automatically comes in. I mean, the river flows, the snow melt, the hydroelectric power, floods, agriculture, drought, they all these things would be impacted when the climate change is actually happening. In terms of going into more extremes, in terms of more resources being demanded for certain services, or resources being depleted, not enough, habitat, ecological services available for both humans and other species. So for us, it becomes really very critical to even look at climate change when we say that we want to work in water resources. Just some more data. I mean, like over 50% South Asians, that's more than 50, actually have been impacted by one natural disaster or another in the past decade. And this is pretty interesting, this one, Bangladesh. I mean, women and children are 14 times more likely to die, especially in floods, actually. So, I mean, huge gender issues also out there. I mean, you have disempowered communities, I mean, and especially women. I mean, so it's really amazing the kind of vulnerability that women will face vis-a-vis men, in the same setting, in the same geographic. I mean, if you just look at the cost, I mean, these are staggering. I mean, we talk of $100 billion of Sandy. I mean, you look at these costs which such poor countries have faced over the last, let's say, about 19 or 20 years. If you look at it, it's amazing. I mean, this is coming to what, $44 trillion. And these are not small numbers. I mean, this is what our total economy probably is, or less. Something like that. I mean, Afghanistan itself has faced losses of like $69 billion. Bangladesh, really highly vulnerable, nearly $13 trillion. These are the kind of losses that have been faced by all natural disasters. That includes floods, I mean, earthquakes, mudslides, cyclones. I mean, you name it, we have it. It's like that.
So how do you calculate that?
Yeah, okay, this is, I think part of it is replacement value. This is actually, this is the source that is there. I'm not sure of the methodology, to be honest with you, but I think part of the replacement value, part of it is in terms of the actual money that went into relief services. But I mean, this website can actually, the one that is here, this will actually be able to eliminate it. This is UN basically data. You will see the Himalayan glacier, the black line, the highest melt rate. This is into minus, if you look at it, the highest melt rate among all the glaciers of the world. And that way, I'm not sure actually how true this is, because there are any contested opinions. And this is on really very, very limited data, honestly. I mean, you have the Gangotri Glacier, which is probably the most studied. NASA went and took photographs over time, and it was splashed all over. And then, but it's only the so-called tongue of the glacier. You don't know what is the mass balance still. Is it still being added? I mean, nobody really knows that. Those studies are not really being done. Recent studies have termed that actually the glaciers of Western Himalayas, more Karakoram, Pamir area, they're actually adding mass volume. They're not actually melting. So, I mean, really nobody even knows whether even this data is actually correct. I mean, if it is, but comparative studies have actually shown they're the highest. I mean, the sea level rise, if you really, that's another scenario that is really, affecting very, very poor communities and very large number of people. making them much more vulnerable. Especially if you look at the eastern coast. I mean, very vulnerable to cyclones. That's where cyclones have been coming with regular frequency. And that's also the poorer side actually of South Asia compared to the western coast, which doesn't get cyclones and which is actually relatively well off. And probably there's also a direct link between being so vulnerable to natural disasters and actually not having the kind of economic growth. And it relates to the earlier slide where I was showing what kind of losses actually the countries do face from natural disasters. They are just kept poor because of natural disasters. This is a map of Sundarbans, which is probably, I would say, even among South Asia, the most vulnerable region. I would say that. This is the delta of 3 river systems: Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna. I mean, this part is kind of forest reserve, famous for Royal Bengal tiger, and the rest. This is Kolkata, and the rest all you have rivers. I mean, and you really have to. I mean, this map actually does no justice to the complexity of this, the delta system, the estuarine system, honestly. You have to go there. I mean, these estuaries that you're seeing, these could be several kilometers wide. I mean, these rivulets, what they are seemingly here, 30, 40 meters deep. I mean, and the kind of tidal flow that comes in, it's amazing. I mean, you will see so much erosion, so much accretion, you really don't even recognize the place. Maps change. I mean, the international boundary doesn't mean sacrosanct. They had to read this whole thing because this river itself has shifted positions, which was the boundary between India and Bangladesh. And totally muddy. I mean, and most of the sediments that you find actually come from 4,000 meters and above. Because of the relatively young age of the Himalayas, that's where the maximum erosion actually is happening. So first people tried all kind of watershed management, they blamed deforestation for it, everything. You tried all those issues. Then realized you were making no impact after spending billions of dollars. Why? Then you studied actually all the erosion is actually happening 4,000 meters and above. And that's a natural geological process. You can't do anything about it. There's no way you can actually do it. I mean, humanly possible. I mean, you can do nothing about kind of sediments that are coming. I mean, here Sundarbans, and this is especially a focus area for the work that we are doing. I mean, poverty is really deep. I mean, and in migration, I mean, you have migration both from Bangladesh into India, and then you have migration going out. I mean, it's really, and this was actually, a no person's land till very recently. By recently, I mean about 150 years back. The Britishers kind of decided they needed more revenue, so they brought in people from way up who had no culture of living with the sea, living with the water, and they gave them land. And how they got land was actually to develop powders, what you call these, in Dutch you call them powders or embankments effectively. So all the communities in Sundarbans that you see actually here, I mean all this part, they're actually living below sea level, at least below the high tide level. And that's what makes them really vulnerable. So if there's a cyclone, the water just comes in, salt water just comes in. Right. I mean, you can't even farm in that land anymore. So they are trying to farm in an area where actually farming is probably one profession you shouldn't actually do. And now they've taken up another second profession, which is prawn farming, which is even worse. I mean, the kind of ecological impacts that it is having is probably 5 times more, I mean, the cost to environment than any other kind of cost. Just the prawn farming itself. And this really is, I mean, very, very vulnerable to sea level rise. And the sea level rising in Sundarbans because of 2 reasons. So it's at a much faster rate than global sea level rise. One is obviously the sea itself is rising, but because of the heavy sediment load, the land itself is subsiding actually. So actually the sea level is more than double, I mean, effectively. And it's in the region that you really don't want any sea level rise to happen. People are anyway living below the sea level, effectively. And what happens is when the because of prawn farming, what's happening is the water gets trapped up and the tidal flow becomes very intense and it's just scurrying down. So if it's a channel, and then they've created embankments on the banks of the channel, it goes to the very foundation and destroys the foundation of the embankment, they just collapse inside. So it just, and we actually had to undertake a huge study just to know, and we couldn't find a single geomorphologist in the region actually who could study that. We had to go to Cambridge actually to hire a geomorphologist to actually come and study in terms of why this phenomena is really happening and how do you really design embankments which will stay at least which will protect you at least once in a 50-year flood or once in a 20-year flood, that kind of thing. So I mean, even the capacity actually can be a cause of concern. I mean, look at what I was just talking about poverty. I mean, this is basically the population density. The higher the darker the color, the higher the population density. Look at it, so vulnerable. I mean, you have very high population densities. I mean, this one is like 200 and, 1,000, yeah, or more. I mean, so this is the highest, and then poverty is again the darker the color, the more poor they are. If you see this part, high population, high poverty. If you just go to it. I mean, you really have to travel to this region to realize the enormous complexity and of Sundarbans. Really, there's no way humanly possible to describe it by a film or by a talk. These are the major. Just look at the number of cyclones that have passed. This was in 2009, the last one, the major one which hit India. This is the Sidr, which is the Sidr one. This is the Sidr which came. Bangladesh, and I mean they just cause untold damage, and most of it goes even unrecorded.
So I think Sanjay, it's better to point out that what is called cyclone is called a hurricane here.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. What we call a cyclone, or
in South Asia, is actually a hurricane.
Okay. Yes. Thanks, Amin, for that. Yes. I mean, these are very eastern coast phenomena here. Okay. Now we'll come back to little less. I mean. Really, rivers really are very, very important because of the high poverty rates. Rivers are even closer to livelihood people because of high farming, because of other livelihood options. Water is really a key resource for that, and that's why when climate change happens or when rivers gets polluted or the resources are depleted, it really impacts the poorest the most. In fact, something I haven't written about culturally, religiously, again, rivers are very important. I don't know if you read the news. We had the Kumbh festival just going on till mid-January to mid-February. It just ended, I think, last week. On one single day, we had 30 million people taking bath in the Ganges at a single spot. That's larger than the population of most countries, globally speaking. Okay, and over a month, if you look at it, there were 5 bathing days or 6 bathing days. We had close to 100 million actually come. And they made 25,000 toilets for them. Imagine 25,000 toilets for 100 million. I mean, that's nothing. I mean, in the Sundarbans itself, they hold a festival, Ganga Sagar festival, which is held every year. That attracts close to 1 million people. And they probably had, I think, maybe 200 toilets for 1 million. So, and that's over like 3 days. So, I mean, it's also religious, very close, and that is the impact of high, really, density when we really look at it. It's not only daily, but these huge shocks that come to the river systems, I mean, what are the water channels? Some I've just mentioned, river flows are variable within years and across years. I mean, within year, I just mentioned the monsoon. I mean, Ganges, for example, like Indus is most glacier dependent. With 30 to 40% from ice and snow melt. Ganges only about 5%. Brahmaputra is about 13% or 15% maximum. So they're really dependent on monsoon for their flows, rains for their flows. But that happens only in 3 months. So you have a peak like this. You'll go like this, and then like this, and then like this. Pretty much. That's your flow really that happens in these rivers. Another big problem is that you think, okay, let's create a dam. The total, all possible dams that you could build, for example, in the Ganges, will hold 25% of the annual flow. Aswan in Egypt will hold 250% flow, just a single dam. The dam on Colorado, that holds about 150%. Because of the steep topography of the Himalayas, even if you create a 120-meter high dam, the size of the lake is really very small because the gradient is steep like this. So really don't get much volume water behind that. So not only is a dam and then you have seismic issues of building dams, very young mountain range. So you have all those topography, so you spend much more to get very little water. But you still have to, because all your water flows in 3 months, and after that you're left with nothing. Cherrapunji, that's also the wettest place on earth. That's in Meghalaya, northeast India. I think the average rainfall there is about 2,800 millimeters a year. That's like 28 meters. It is also the place where people walk miles to get drinking water, beginning November till May. It's the driest place on earth practically during these dry months. All the water just flows down, flows away. Hard rock formations can't store water, difficult to do water harvesting. And that's supposed the wettest place on earth in terms of rainfall. And the same place, same country, right now the Western India is facing huge drought since, let's say, June of last year. And we had huge floods in Assam. Same place in Assam was flooded thrice. Beginning of monsoon, middle of monsoon, end of monsoon. Okay. Pakistan has been, facing floods for 3 continuous years now, large floods. 2010, 2011, 2012. And I know of areas where, the administration will first plan for floods relief, then they'll plan for drought relief. Okay. Within a span of 6 months, I'm talking. So those are this thing. Sediment load, huge sediment load. Very specific solutions have to be done for hydropower, because sediment just destroy the fins in your turbines completely. So very special solutions, which obviously make it much more expensive, but still, they're destroying. They also, but more than the fins, they clog up your storage space. You plan a dam for 50 years. This was originally done when sediment wasn't understood, and pretty much you lose 50–60% of your storage space in a matter of less than a decade. And this happens across South Asia. So your electricity production, your irrigation potential, all fall down completely. So all your plans go awry. What you have made in terms of water management or water planning. And the water is very conditioned. There are very few treaties actually, despite hundreds of rivers, you'll find actually transboundary rivers in South Asia. We keep talking about Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra, but they comprise so many large rivers, large in their own state. And so they're transboundary. Most rivers really in South Asia are transboundary. Really, very little. You have Ganges Strait between India and Bangladesh, then you have the Indus Strait between India and Pakistan. Other than that, you have data exchange protocols among countries, but only for flood data, flood-related data. For example, in Satluj, there was this big flooding that happened one year because of the glacial lake outburst. After that, a protocol was set up. So actually, after a calamity happens, somehow a protocol is put in place, but never before that. And even then, the data is too little. So you'll get data on a single river from maybe 2 flow stations or 3 flow stations. Most data really is classified information. If I'm caught with data on Ganges flow, I'll be put behind bars. It's like that. These are state secrets. Same in China, same in Pakistan. Most of the flow data is really state secret in all countries, because they believe that water is so crucial, so important. They need to not even share data, otherwise they will somehow lose the negotiating power. So then, how do you actually do research? How do you develop solutions if you don't even have access to any data? Really? And I think the more interesting part is that you're not even sure if the data that they claim to have, number one, exists, and number two, is it even correct? I have seen data for 12 months a year of a post where the person was entitled to 30 days leave, and there was no other person replacing that person to take data. So how did they get that other 30 days of data? Logically, you would just imagine. Okay? So those are the kind of things, even the data, what really sanctity it has. The tidal data you won't find anywhere. Sundarbans, that whole area, you probably have one tidal gauge on the Kolkata harbour. You won't find. But we were trying to model it for a coastal zone management project. No bathymetric data available, no flow available, nothing. So we have to start right from scratch. We are starting right now, trying to first obtain equipment, then get all the data, and then only we can model. So it becomes a 3-year process, really. What could have been a 3-month process? And yet, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, very high economic growth, you must have heard South Asia, very high economic growth. Even faster rising aspirations, I would say. You know, population, increasing installation, urbanization, demand for food is really rising. But, I mean, it's all really. This I've kind of just spoken about, that we really have no data kind of to even start looking at, actually this is no local weather, I'm sorry, it's the wrong word here. I mean, even weather predictions, it's difficult to even really get, you know. So for farmers who want to kind of plant crops, I mean, they, determine those kind of things. There's really no weather prediction even locally. You just, I mean, I know communities that actually download data from US sites, US satellites, I mean, naval data and those kind of things, NOAA data, and actually will then develop their own local prediction models. But that is not accepted by the government. It's, you know, so they will never say, okay, your data is correct or your information is correct. So they'll never, in fact, share it. They will not facilitate sharing that information with others, simply because it's not their own data. Still, I mean, with all this depressing kind of scenario, we still are very optimistic. We still are very hopeful. I mean, why? There are really huge benefits, I would say, to cooperation. If countries are really able to cooperate, and there are instances of low-level cooperation, the benefits have been immense. I mean, if you just take the case of the Indus River, I mean, a treaty was signed in, I think, 1960, you know, after probably 12 years of negotiation practically, has outlived like 4 wars actually. And it still kind of determines, you know, water allocation. 3 western rivers are assigned to Pakistan and 3 eastern rivers to India. I mean, and they, you know, a very healthy kind of arbitration mechanism it has. But that's still not, and one of the clauses of the Indus Treaty is clause 7, which actually looks at future joint cooperation. That nobody wants to even read, talk, hear about actually. At that point, that is what was envisaged, that, you know, more joint development of projects. For example, if you heard recently the Kishanganga project, you know, they were both India and Pakistan were arbitrating over this issue of who has right to develop hydropower project, you know, run-of-the-river project on that particular river. And, you know, if they actually were to do it jointly, it would be so wonderful. You probably get, it would be much cheaper, and the resources, the output of power would be much higher. The environmental impacts would be much less. So, I mean, those are kind of things we believe actually, you know, in terms of, but to start at a lower level, in terms of just flood management, you know, which is really a very crucial kind of development issue for us in terms of the losses, how it really impacts the poor, in terms of just studying climate change. So how do you really make an entry? I mean, these are the entry points for us into water, because if I go and tell the government that, okay, I'm interested in working water resources, I get thrown out in a jiffy. You know, I can't do that. So I have to use entry points like climate change, I have to use entry points like flood management, disaster management, which are non-controversial, so to say, and more, you know. I mean, there are still benefits of, you know, I mean, sharing, what I was mentioning, this joint structures you have, you share. The idea is not to share water. Right now, the whole discourse is, okay, how do I share waters? How do I divide waters? But the idea is, can you actually start thinking of, okay, this is an integrated river system. Can I look at actually, okay, what are the benefits that are going to, that accrue to society from it in terms of agricultural irrigation, hydropower, in terms of cultural uses, in terms of drinking water, in terms of environmental flows, in terms of ecological services. And then we start, okay, how do we maximize those benefits for them? So those are the kind of things that we are positive about working on, you know, to this is, for example, you know, the first benefits of just the ecosystem, then productivity, what I mentioned, the economic benefits, then you have political, you know, the policy shift to cooperation development, and because of the river, and the other is even beyond, because once people start cooperating on one little aspect, that trust really builds in. I mean, why there's no cooperation in anything, even trade, is really the lack of trust. You know, that if I become too dependent on X country for supply of a certain good or services, then somehow that service will be yanked off at the right time, at the wrong time for me and the right time for them in case of any dispute. So then I'll lose my negotiating power. So it is basically this whole concept of I want to be so independent that actually I become weak in some sense. you've heard this term, the wicked questions. I mean, for us, these are wicked questions because forget the solutions. You can't even begin to define the problem at hand. And that's what a wicked problem or a wicked question really is. I mean, where do you begin? How do you define what is really the problem? Is it political? Is it social? Is it institutional? Is it lack of data? Or is it lack of intent? And how do you then, I mean, where do you kind of, start really, I mean, do you work with elected representatives? Do you work with even the non-elected politicians? Or do you work with civil society first? How do you bring them together when they hold such disparate views on different things, on communities, with communities? So for us, it actually, this is what we call a wicked problem. And this aspect especially, more than one's knowledge. This is so true in the space that we work in. Every entity will come up with certain knowledge, which is equally validated with equal level of conviction, and yet they are totally contradictory. How do you really deal in that environment? How do you even begin to negotiate in such an environment? So this is the kind of process that we follow, is to create really knowledge and evidence, in collaboration with partners who differ. So at least there is some consensus, okay, this is something I'm willing to accept up to this level. Okay. To create dialogue, to kind of, this is the broader, then to actually start from these two, how do you really create coalitions, to change the scenario. And this is really initiative, South Asia Water Initiative. This is what really I'm kind of part of. 75% of my work actually is with this. It's kind of an initiative of the World Bank in association with Australia, Norway, and United Kingdom, where we are actually trying to do these things, which is, creating evidence for knowledge, creating really dialogue, creating opportunities, multi-stakeholder platforms, and then trying to build coalitions. And we had the phase one, which was, practically from 2009, 2012. And then phase two, now we are just beginning. And this is when I have joined, and you'll know why I have joined right now, actually, this initiative, and why I wasn't involved in phase one. These are the kind of activities we did in phase one, which was building knowledge. We actually took the whole Ganges basin and we did a strategy. So in terms of what are the various inputs into the main stem, the different tributaries, where is the water going out through distributaries, where is the water dam, to kind of build a whole model. And then we had this groundwater study, because again, the South Asia groundwater is huge. In spite of probably the most extensive irrigation network that South Asia has, globally speaking, 80% of irrigation is done through groundwater. And if you look at the Ganges basin, the eastern Ganges itself has a rechargeable groundwater potential of 25, roughly of the scale of 25 billion cubic meters. And that's rechargeable potential, just that. And which is probably the entire volume you would get on building all the dams, upstream dams in the Himalayas. And you have this water already ready for you. Then, setting up a regional monitoring center. This was more looking at climate-related data and glacier data. So these are kind of activities we did in the past. The Ganges assessment, one of our key works that we did, which I just mentioned about. And yet, this was something that was done, and I can share with you that it's not even published till now. It's been like a year and a half since the study is ready to be published. I can't get permissions from the government to publish it. Each government feels that the World Bank somehow has gone against their interest and taken the interest of other countries. And that other country then tells me, no, you've gone against our interest, you've helped those countries. And this was supposed to be, as I say, a so-called knowledge scientific study. And that's when you realize, there is no single knowledge. There is no scientific knowledge as such, which is equally acceptable to all. Then we did kind of strengthening of water management, in different countries, setting up this National Ganga River Basin Authority. And now they have a plan to actually spend close to $1.5 billion trying to clean up the Ganges River, really, the Indian stretch of the Ganges. But our estimate is that they will probably need to spend $25 billion over the next as many years, 25 years to do that. And the money that they have taken a loan from the bank and their own is only $1.5 billion. So it's really very, very little. And no country, as far as we know, has attempted to clean such a huge river at the income level that it was. And then, so all these kind of technical advisory services. This was, for example, in Bangladesh in terms of how do they do clean production of textiles. So you pollute the waters much less because now they are becoming a huge export country for textiles. Both US and European markets. So how do they use much less water, and even the water that they use, how it doesn't become. This is what we learned and why actually now I have been invited to join the team, The focus on generation of knowledge and providing space for cooperation, and we had these flagship activities, but it fell short. Activism piecemeal engagement with governments was really not strong. So this is now the job that I've been entrusted with actually, with my skill set they've asked me to do. Totally disembodied from the political economy. That's again my responsibility. So I've been specially hired now to really look at these aspects why I've been made a team member. It's political economy, engagement with governments, and stakeholder consultations. How do you relate what work you're doing? How do you build consensus from the beginning to even frame your research questions rather than we do something and then say, oh, okay, now let's try to develop a consensus of the outcome. You design your whole work, frame the research questions in consultation, in collaboration with others. So that's the lesson that we have learned. And one would imagine that these things are, knowing the nature of water, you would imagine that we would have been smart enough to do these things. We weren't. So now this is what we are doing now, phase 2. We began actually just last month, January. We have divided into actually these 4 landscapes of basins, Ganges, Indus. Earlier we couldn't even say we are doing some work on the Ganges or the Indus. It was too contentious. The country said, no, you can't talk of a river basin. You just talk, overall you're working on somehow in the region, then that is so fudgy that it doesn't create problems for anyone. Somehow we managed to actually say, okay, we can actually work on these 3 river basins and Sundarbans. Because of, as I said, it's so vulnerable, so poor, we actually wanted to focus on it as a separate area, so to say. And then we have all tying them up is actually a regional component, in terms of which will take care of a lot of, and I work kind of as part of the regional component in terms of understanding the political economy, relating all that to the work that will be done here. And earlier we were really doing all the work in terms of the research and knowledge generation. The current model that we're in this now phase is we'll actually let it out. So we'll actually just give out the money for local institutions, local organizations to actually do knowledge development, to create knowledge networks or stakeholder networks, so that there is much more, I think, local ownership, and also I would say positively much more local relevance to the actual needs of the communities of the countries themselves. So it's not just being smart, I think it's also being more effective, more efficient with your money. And then we have these were thematic really points you'll notice. And nowhere you'll notice water resource management, though the whole program I can assure is about water resource management, and you don't find that term here really, water resources management at all. Because the moment I talk of it, I don't get to work. So these are our entry points, so to say. And these are some of the core principles which we actually have formed, learning from phase 1. And notice participatory and deliberative. We really have to do that, inclusive, multidisciplinary. We learned that. Earlier we did a lot of, I think, national activities, and that's why we found it difficult to really relate to regional cooperation. So we really now are very conscious. Our work, even if it is national nature, has to relate to transboundary or cross-boundary. And here you will see, okay, we work in water resources management. I may not state it very obviously when I talk to the client countries. So pretty much that's it. Thank you very much for such patient hearing.
Questions?
Yes, please.
Going back to the Sundarban,
Yeah.
with the prawn farming,
Yeah.
you did indicate that it's affected the environment.
Yeah.
Did it help to alleviate poverty in any
I'm
way?
sorry?
Did it help in alleviating poverty? Because the original intention was to.
Mhm. Yes. It is, if you look at income levels, yes. I mean, the prawn farming obviously is a good livelihood option for several families. And that is why the recommendation is not to ban prawn farming. But also the thing is that the overall cost to the economy, if you take environmental costs into view, are probably 100 times more than what the community is benefiting. I mean, that's the scale we're talking about. So the cost versus the benefits. So the idea is to actually, over a period of about 2 decades, is to shift people to different livelihood options. You can't do them over 1 or 2 years. It requires huge investments in training, huge investments in attitudinal change, investing in health, education, capacity building. So I mean, that's the idea is to really go about it in, over at least next 1 to 2 decades to really make a shift to that. Yes, but it is a very good livelihood option for the people who are practicing it in terms of income sales. Yes, please.
I no longer have my recording from George Harrison for the concert from Bangladesh, but I was wondering if there was anything that was not only unusual about the 1970 cyclone that killed up to 500,000 people, but whether or not the region is safer or more vulnerable now than it was then.
Safer, no. For some key reasons. I mean, there are better cyclone or hurricane, what we want to call it, warning systems in place than they were at that point. So that is one really, I would say, significant improvement. I mean, they're able to track them, over the, as the moment as you were tracking Sandy here, you're able to track them and just kind of figure, okay, where the impact could potentially happen, but the last one where it hits the shore many times is still, not possible to see that. So that is one positive. They have huge cyclone shelters also made. But if you look at the number of people that could be accommodated in the cyclone shelters, for example, vis-a-vis the population, then it is a minuscule percentage. The other is that, are these cyclone shelters really active in terms of maintenance and all? No. I was visiting, forget Sundar, I was visiting Tamil Nadu and Pondicherry, which is the south eastern coast of India, and there we are doing work on, again, post-tsunami project. Tsunami came in 2001 there, and now this is the second project we're doing there. I mean, I think up to 80% of the communication equipment was not functioning. So it's very easy to, I think, set up shelters, to buy communication systems, those kind of things. The difficulty really, institutionally speaking, is in maintaining those over time. When the sense of urgency really goes out of your mind, then these things start to deteriorate. And another reason why it is not safe, the population is only increasing, mind you. It's not decreasing. Your density is increasing, everything. You have much more with the economic growth, so the economic losses will also be far higher now. The embankments are practically still the same. They are as weak or as strong, as badly designed, you may say. I would say, probably venture to say that no, I don't think people are any safer overall. We feel we are safer. In some respect we are safer, but we'll also become much more vulnerable in other respects. So in balance, I would say we are more vulnerable. In fact, the kind of talk that is going on, especially among civil society and among a lot of other research institutions, is how do you do actually a voluntary migration, out-migration from Sundarbans over the next 3 to 4 decades. Because this area is simply too vulnerable, too unlivable, and it will only become worse with the rising sea level. Because the impacts of any storm event multiply with rising sea level. So I mean that's really is to, okay, no, this place, because you could be spending too much money to protect too little, you know, in terms of the actual benefit that will come. So that's really now the discussion going on.
So obviously overpopulation and continued growth of population is critical to everything. Is there any hope for stabilizing things?
Yeah. The population will, I mean the net growth rate is really stabilizing now. In fact, at rates far higher than planned. I mean, far better than planned and predicted, actually, projected. So actually the population, it's still rising, but the growth rate is now far lower, and it will stabilize, I think, by 2050 or something. It will stabilize. But India by then will be the most populous country in the world. Right now China holds that honor. India will be the most, I think already India has about 1.1 billion, and I think the stabilization will be 1.5 billion roughly, actually. So, I mean, it will only increase, even when we talk of stability, it will only, and part of the reason is very low social indicators of education, of health, you know, all that. I mean, people feel very insecure. Yes, please.
Do you have any conclusion about the impact of the pollution on people? Because I'm thinking particularly about the Ganges, and I know it's a big problem there. Like the waters are really polluted, and do you have any prevision about how, because people over there are really dependent on the Ganges, and do you have any prevision because of the rate of pollution?
Do I have any
Provision.
Or
provision?
improving?
Yes, I mean, the rivers, I mean, Ganges is just one example of a polluted river. All rivers are polluted. I'll just tell you that, period. The one river which is kind of not so polluted is really Brahmaputra, simply because it is in an area which is still relatively, has very few industries, low population, but it is also the most dangerous river, probably globally speaking, I would say. I mean, in terms of floods, in terms of eating its own river banks, you know, I mean, every year, I mean, tens of hundreds of square kilometers of land gets washed away from Brahmaputra. It just eats into its own banks. So you have farmland today, after 1 month you come, there's no farmland, there's only river, you know. And then, so, but pollution, just coming back to your thing, yes, pollution, I think people are conscious of it, but the resources required, and by resources not just money, in terms of the expertise, in terms of the institutional capacity, in terms of the long-term commitment, that still doesn't really exist. And if anything, pollution levels are only increasing, they're not decreasing. And you have pollution from industry, including high metals. In fact, one of the studies now says that the middle stretch of the Ganges, Allahabad, Kanpur, that whole area, actually the rate of cancer in the population there is much higher than elsewhere. And people are attributing it because of the heavy metal pollution in that stretch of the Ganges. Very high industrial pollution, Kanpur, Allahabad, Varanasi. Varanasi is, you know, that supposed to be in Hindu mythology the holiest city. Then you have municipal pollution. You know, most of the currently, I think, for the Ganges basin, probably only 1/3 of the water is treated before it's let out in the river. 65–70% is put untreated into the river. Municipal waste I'm talking about. Then you have farm pollution happening in terms of pesticides, in terms of nitrates, inordinate use of both pesticides and fertilizers actually is leading to, again, a very heavy pollution from farmland also in terms of runoff. So that's not a kind of point source of pollution, but general runoff that happens. So all three are quite strong. The rivers actually right now, if you look at the quality, they're fit for nothing. It's even difficult to take the water out and somehow treat it for drinking. In fact, if you I mean, a large number of these cities actually rely upon groundwater extraction near the river. Like if you look at Pakistan, Lahore, which is the largest city, it's on River Ravi. But the River Ravi is so polluted, Lahore city actually pumps water up from ground to supply drinking water throughout the city. It doesn't use the river water. Then they use the river water to put back untreated sewage. So essentially the river has become a sewage and drinking water comes from your groundwater. But efforts are being undertaken. Yes, efforts are being undertaken. Like I mentioned, the project of the Ganges, even otherwise. I think the courts have taken a very strong view, not just in India, but even in other countries in South Asia, in terms of that things need to be cleaned up. There is now a much bigger constituency to have clean rivers. So investments are being done in every respect, but they are still very short, very few, and I think more will need to be done. Cindy, and then I'll continue this.
In your opinion, do you think it will be possible in the summer months to reduce the poverty without reducing the population? In your opinion?
Yes. I mean, if you look at Europe, Europe has very high population density. So population by itself is not really a problem. It is actually when it is accompanied with other weak social indicators that it becomes a problem. Just an example, this is Sagar Island here. This is Sagar Island. You'll notice very high poverty levels. This is also considered the kind of southernmost tip of the river Ganges. There is the river Hooghly, which is a district of the Ganges. So, and this is where the festival I was saying happens. Where 1 million people converge over 3 days to bathe in this, in this confluence of the sea and the river. That's what they believe. This is the confluence point. Now, what has been done? This has received electricity. This whole island has about 250,000 people living in it. Maybe 300,000, but anyway, kind of that level. They got electricity for the first time ever, and I mean grid electricity, about only 4 months back. But that has totally changed. I mean, when I last visited it, I was on my way back in the ferry, and I saw someone carrying a photocopier machine and a scanner. That's a luxury, let me tell you. You can't run those things like city. Those are the, I go and look there. Housing certainly quality is better because they're able to actually do welding. Earlier, you couldn't even do welding. You couldn't use metal in construction simply because there was no way you could weld. So I mean, even though just the fact of providing grid electricity is changing lives. People are able to study better. The students, the livelihood options have multiplied, literally multiplied. Without doing anything else, no capital injection, no capacity building injection, nothing you have done. You have just started providing grid electricity. So yes, I mean things will happen, but I think you cannot rely upon natural resources for livelihood long term. That is the key problem. Is over reliance on natural resources, which are too few, population is too high, you cannot escape poverty. The key will be, can you really get these people out of natural resource dependence in terms of livelihood options? And that's why the idea is to improve education levels, improve health levels, so that they actually are able to take up professions, take up jobs, and hopefully voluntarily out-migrate. Yes.
Maybe 1 or 2 more questions and then
Please.
continue.
Yeah, this is addressed more to the students here. When I first came here about 10 years ago, you were brought up as a very unusual student because you applied mathematical techniques to both physics and biology. And I wanted to kind of ask you, in terms of the students and their advisors, how much your mathematical ideas enable you to do what you're doing. Mathematics is, if you read it, is the basis of physics, biology, and economics.
Yes, yes, yes.
So, I'm asking the students and their advisors how much you think that your training has enabled you to do what you want, what you're doing.
A lot. now I'll embarrass Dongping, with an anecdote. When and this totally relates to the question that you've asked. When Dongping took me on as a student, he says, okay, let's have two things clear. I said, okay, what? First, he says, keep your personal life happy. If you are personally unhappy, there's no way you can deliver professionally. So you don't need to bother if you need to take leave, do this, do that. He says, I want you to be personally happy in your life, then only you will become a better professional. I said, okay. I said, what's the second thing? He says, if you have a problem, try to solve it yourself. If you can't solve it, go to the library, read up. And those were before the internet era, okay? So I really had to physically read papers, kind of. First search for them, he says, read up. Then you can't solve, talk to your colleagues. He says, do everything possible in the world, then only come to me. Okay? And I think this answers. Basically, it is the training the training to really look towards solving problems, becoming solutions oriented, using all possible tools, working with others in a collaborative capacity. The power of analysis that you develop while working on research, all that I'm doing now, it is totally, I'm using the same skill set that I developed here right now. There's no difference, honestly. It's just that the field is different, but the basic skill set, the orientation is still the same.
Yeah, maybe I'll just follow up, because I think there's a lot of students interested in policy these days, and there's really no difference whether it's there or in US Congress.
Yes.
So I think maybe you can just say a few words if you have any advice to students in terms what they should do, how they prepare when they're doing their science here. If you are interested in policy kind of issue, it doesn't have to be there. I'm pretty sure you said.
Okay. Okay, it's difficult to actually give advice. But I mean, what I realize is that there is increasing appreciation now for knowledge to be part of policy making, even in South Asia, which there wasn't earlier. So that's, I think, a very positive step, and I think you are in the right place in terms of actually acquiring, a certain set of knowledge or a certain set of skills. The other really thing about policy is to, I think, start doing unthinkable things, to take risks, really. Policy is all about risk. I mean, it's about taking decisions about human beings with practically very, very little data information, if you ask me. And it is so different in that sense from the work that we do here. Because here we are so very sure of, every step we are, and policy doesn't work that way, honestly at all. When I went to Washington to work, it was a culture shock for me, honestly, going from Stony Brook to that. How decisions get taken in Congress. We have this kind of very utopian view of policymakers and things like that, but how decisions are taken, but that's the reality. And you realize that it is still a science, it is still probably the most efficient way to take decisions. Because if they were to follow the same process that we take, there would never be any decision, honestly. And I think another key thing that helps is really being able to relate the work that you're doing to the needs of the society. How is it benefiting, or how could potentially benefit? I think that that connection is very important, not only for greater conviction of your work, but to be able to tell someone as to how you can actually benefit them or society, as a whole. I think these were those would be very crucial. We tend to many times live in our own little cocoon, and we think that anything that is non-science is not desirable, kind of, or it's somehow suboptimal in terms of decision making. The one thing that I had to do was totally unlearn all that, and then you begin learning.
Well, thank you very much. This was great.
Thank you.
And then, Sarah, if you'd like to continue some discussions, there's lunch in the Akuba room, and Sunday will be